Fujifilm's X-Summit 2020 in London, including the announcement of the new X100V. Ricoh still makes point-and-shoot cameras. Sony's warning about the coronavirus, and Michael Stipe as Photographer of the Week on this segment of Take's Take.
Thanks so much for tuning in for another episode of Photography Radio. My name is Tomasz, and today you are listening to Take's Take with Take Kayo, where he covers what's new and interesting in the world of photography, including digital, analog, mobile, and everything in between. Enjoy.
Can you imagine your life without photography? No? Then you will love this show. And it doesn't matter if you're a DSLR, a mirrorless, or a mobile phone shooter. We're here to help your photography grow. This is Photography Radio.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Take's Take, which is my take on photography news this week. And I am back home in Vancouver and ready to work hard just for you to bring you the news. So let's begin now. Following last year's X-Summit Tokyo 2019, with the star of the show being the GFX 100, this year's X-Summit London 2020 was clearly all about the brand new X100V, or Roman numeral 5 for the fifth iteration of their most iconic X-series camera. The X100V has pretty much everything that we're all asking for. We asked for an all-new design lens, weather sealing, articulating LCD screen, and the latest sensor and processor. Now, from the outside, the camera looks very close to the previous version, and if you aren't really into the X100 series, it looks identical to all other four versions, including the previous lens mount accessories that are compatible with this new lens design. But when we look closely, there are clear differences. Because of the new aluminum top panel, the design has a sharper, more futuristic look, a la Tesla Cybertruck or Apple's latest iPad Pros with the sharp lines. The viewfinder cup is much larger, with the same hybrid viewfinder that's found on the brand new X Pro 3. Although the new LCD is articulating, but it's also flush against the body, and it's really hard to tell that it does articulate to many unless you knew that it does. And the biggest change is the removal of the D-pad, aesthetically speaking, something that Fujifilm has been doing since the release of the XE3 in favor of a joystick and touchscreen, which I've been a fan of, but not all of you have. The oddest update is the new weather sealing, which includes the entire body. It is all weather sealed, which is great, which includes the viewfinder mechanism, because some had complained that dust would find its way in, but it doesn't include the lens. Now, to seal up the lens, you need to buy the optional lens filter adapter, which isn't that expensive, but it also makes the lens protrude out a little bit further than perhaps Fuji wanted to, which is probably the reason why they didn't make it a standard issue item, as it does interfere with the overall pancake-like design aesthetics of the entire X series line. The price will be $1,400 US at launch, and for further details, you have to check out Fujifilm's website. And for a really well-written review, check out Jonas Rask's well-written review on his website, and I'll leave the details in the show notes. At the very end of the conference, the summit, Fujifilm also announced, it was kind of odd, but they announced pre-announced the release of the upcoming X-T4 that'll be launched on February 26th. Now, Fujifilm has been doing this sort of pre-announcement lately, including the release of the previously mentioned GFX 100, as well as the new X Pro 3. And I don't really understand it, except maybe it builds up anticipation and really keeps them ahead of the curve, since there's so much of a demand for updated news on these new cameras that perhaps many people are now going to the rumor sites to keep up with the latest information, and perhaps this is Fujifilm's way of reacting to this. So that's maybe the future of how they will announce cameras, a pre-announcement before the release. Fujifilm also announced updates to their lens roadmap for both X mount and GF mount lenses. Now there's going to be 3 new XF series lenses and 2 new GF series lenses, including the GF 30mm f3.5 and a 80mm f1.7. Now for the X mount, by the end of the year, Fujifilm said that they will have a total of 38 lenses for the X series, and they did bring a prototype of the XF 50mm f1.0, or their NOC, being one of them, and two more lenses that they didn't reveal what it would be. And I'm thinking that one of them might be a sort of a super telephoto prime, something maybe not super, but like a 300mm f2.8 or something like that, or 400 2.8, and perhaps another specialty lens, maybe a shift or tilt lens, or another prime ultra wide lens, or just an addition to one of the Fujicron or the Fujilux lenses. But what do you think? The final interesting news from the X-Summit was an upcoming firmware update on the medium format GFX 100, which allows for the sensor to pixel shift, which is possible because of the IBIS system, because the sensor does shift and the camera knows where it's shifting to. So as it shifts, it can create up to a 400 megapixel image. Now, I'm assuming that this is only in JPEG mode, but if they can also create a raw version of this, and then in camera, you convert it to a TIFF file, the file size of a 400 megapixel TIFF could be, depending on how much detail there is in the image. So if it's like a dark black sky with a little thing in the middle versus a crowd full of people's faces, well, this could be anywhere between, let's say, an 800 megabyte to a 1 gigabyte file for just one of these TIFF files. So for those looking for or needing that type of resolution, then I guess there aren't too many commercially available cameras that can shoot at this type of resolution. This is pretty exciting. I would love to test it. I don't think I need a 400 megapixel file, but I'm sure some of you out there would definitely, maybe like a group shot of 1,000 people or something like that. Now, that's a lot of Fujifilm news, but like an Apple September event, Fujifilm packed a lot of announcements, and it's exciting for a camera manufacturer to give so much insight on upcoming cameras, as well as an inside look into the company itself. And I think this makes their customers, which includes myself and many of you, I'm sure, that we're part of the process, that our input counts, and that we're part of the evolution of their products, as well as their vision for the future. There's been lots of discussions about the death of the point and shoot. And I've always said, and I've written articles on this as well as YouTube videos, that other than the higher end cameras, such as the recently announced Fujifilm X100V, the Sony RX100 line, and the Ricoh GR line, these are higher end cameras, and I think they'll always exist, even the Leica Q to a certain extent. But that the lower end point and shoots, the only ones that will survive are the specialty cameras, such as action cams like GoPros, 360 cameras, and rugged waterproof cameras. And as predicted, Ricoh just announced their latest update to their WG rugged camera lineup, the new WG-70. And I had said that this camera will survive. Now, it's not a huge update, much of it being kind of internal in terms of processing and things like that. But the specs are still very impressive. Now, it's a rugged underwater camera and it's a macro camera. So they almost sort of sell it as a underwater microscope, and it has a decent 16 megapixel 1/2.3 inch sensor, which is very similar to what you would find on some of the higher end smartphones, with a solid 28 to 140 millimeter equivalent zoom lens, with the two flashes, one including it kind of wraps around the lens itself, so that's probably for the macro mode. But that's not why you're buying this camera. You're buying it because it's waterproof down to 14 meters or 46 feet, shockproof from falls up to 1.6 meters or 5 feet, freeze-proof down to -6 degrees, and pressure-proof up to 100 kilogram force or kilopounds. And so this camera is a bit of an anomaly, having all these really powerful, rugged, you can think of construction sites, you can think of divers, any kind of utilities, kind of a government sort of a thing where you're doing surveying, but it also has very weird consumer-like features, like it has a selfie assist mode, a smile capture mode, and this is a really weird one, a face shrinking mode. And I seriously think this is an Asian thing, because why would anyone want to shrink their face? And it also has a time-lapse mode, which I actually think is pretty useful. Now, either way, this is a $280 US priced camera. So it's reasonably priced for all the things that it can do and all the rugged features that are built into it. And I'm really glad that dedicated and especially point and shoots are still around like this camera. Because I was recently in Hong Kong and firsthand watched the news progress as the new coronavirus spread initially in central China and then to other regions of China and then along to the rest of the world. We know how these types of health incidents can affect all sorts of industries such as travel and global trade, but we live in a very connected world, and when something happens in one country, there can be a ripple effect to other countries in ways that we may not see on the surface. China is not only the manufacturing capital of the world, but they're also an integral part of the supply chain of many Japanese manufacturers. Japan is a small island nation with little to no natural resources, so although products like Japanese steel is highly sought after, the raw materials to make that steel has to be imported. Now, in previous decades, it was mostly imported from the United States and Canada, but recently, much of the raw supplies and semi-raw products are now coming from China. On Tuesday, during an investors meeting, Sony announced that although their operating profit and revenue forecast for this current fiscal year is looking good, they warned that due to the coronavirus outbreak in China and now to the rest of the world, that this could disrupt its operations, including their very lucrative sensor business. Since Sony makes 50% of the photographic sensors globally and 70% of smartphone sensors, this will impact the entire industry, whether it's an upcoming iPhone 12 in September or the newest, greatest, latest mirrorless cameras, for instance, the new X-T4 that we just talked about. As mentioned earlier, although the main sensor factories are based in Japan, they are manufactured in Japan, the raw materials to make these sensors come from Sony's supply chain. Many of the suppliers are now based in China. Disruption in the supply chain would mean Sony would have to find new suppliers elsewhere globally, which would take time. Currently, Sony said that they have not yet been able to assess the situation in China as of Tuesday this week, since Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, was extended by the government to try and deal with this spread of the virus. But as factories start operations again this week, or maybe they won't even start up, they can then properly assess the extent of the supply chain interruptions. Now, of course, this is first world problems. What are image sensors compared to people's lives? But this does highlight the fact that we do live in a very connected and global world. And when something happens in our minds very, very far away from us geographically, and we may think that it can't affect us and it won't affect us, that truly is a false sense of security. The fight to contain the coronavirus is a number one, a health issue priority, but it is also a global issue that affects almost every industry and every country in the world. So it's something that we should all be concerned about, and the topic that should be on our minds as we think about our family, our friends, and our colleagues that are affected by this quickly spreading global pandemic. My pick for Photographer of the Week is the frontman for now retired American rock band REM, Michael Stipe. There seems to be a pattern of musicians who are also photographers and vice versa, but we can think of Bryan Adams, Lou Reed, Andy Summers, Lenny Kravitz. Now, Michael Stipe started photography in his teen years and claims to have taken over 37,000 photographs that span from his teen years, photographing bands like the Ramones and Queen when he was younger, and all through his career as a musician in the band REM. He studied photography and painting at university before leaving school to start his now iconic rock band REM. So he is very well versed in the art as well as the craft of photography. His first photo book, called Volume 1, was very well received, and his latest photo book, Our Interference Times, A Visual Record, has been critically praised as he reflects on his past, present, as well as his future. In an interview for the British Journal of Photography, Stipe talks about his involvement with the visual branding of the band REM. He says, quote, I personally produced or oversaw every aspect of visuals and art direction for the entire 31 years that we were an active band. I still oversee the archive and new releases. Now, if you look at his catalog of his photography, due to his access to many famous people, he has many quiet and intimate portraits. One of my favorites is of a sleeping River Phoenix in a car. And as well, there are portraits of Andy Warhol and Kurt Cobain. And again, that comes with access. During the REM days, many dismissed Michael's love of photography as just a hobby, for which he replied, quote, "It meant a lot more to me than that." And it mentions there that many close to him would attest that he always had a camera next to him. In an interview for The Guardian, the interviewer mentioned that he could tell by the way that Michael talked about his photography that he was as passionate about his camera as he was the microphone. Now, since he doesn't participate actively in social media, at least none that I can find, there is no IG, Twitter, or Facebook handle to find, but you can enjoy all the album, cover art, and sleeves that he's done over, as he mentioned, the 31 years of being in REM, as well as his 2 photo books that I've mentioned. And I'll leave a link down in the show notes to his interview with the British Journal of Photography, talking about his latest book. Now, thanks again for joining me for episode 6 for 2020 on Take's Take from Vancouver. Again, I'm back home, which is my take on photography news this week. We have a new feature for photography news. All 4 hosts, we all have our own email address. We'd love to hear from you, from me specifically. Let me know how you're enjoying my format in covering photography news. I know it's a very large and wide subject. Some weeks it's more film-centric, other weeks digital, and other weeks it's mobile. But I do try my best to mix it up since I'm a fan of all things photographic and visual. But let me know if there's something you'd want to hear, or perhaps an expansion of something like a Photographer of the Week, or more news coverage in an area that perhaps I've missed. So email me at photographyradio.com/take, which is spelled take, T-A-K-E, but it's not pronounced that way. So again, photographyradio.com/take to email me directly. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you again next week. Happy shooting.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Hit subscribe on your podcast app. It would mean a lot for us to have you as our regular listener. Head over to photographyradio.com to drop your suggestion for future editions of Photography Radio, or simply to say hello. We would absolutely love to hear from you. In the meantime, have a wonderful night, and we will be back with more photography in your ears very soon.